Call the HOA right now, she doesn't belong here. The words landed hard, echoing across the quiet cul-de-sac like they'd been rehearsed 100 times before, and for a moment, even the breeze seemed to pause, like the neighborhood itself was listening to see what would happen next, because this wasn't just another morning on Maple Ridge Drive, this was the moment everything began to shift, even if no one realized it yet. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Zariah Brooks. She didn't flinch, not when the voice cut through the air, not when every pair of eyes turned toward her like she had just stepped onto a stage she never auditioned for, and definitely not when the man standing across the street folded his arms and looked her up and down like he was measuring her against something she couldn't see. Zariah kept walking, her suitcase rolling behind her in a steady rhythm, wheels clicking softly against the pavement, each step controlled, deliberate, like she had already decided how this moment would end. She wore a simple black t-shirt, fitted jeans, and white sneakers, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed power, nothing that would make anyone think she belonged in a neighborhood where the average home value sat well above $2 million and every driveway held a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. That was the point. She didn't come here to impress anyone. She came to observe. To see. To confirm what she already suspected. A woman standing near a manicured hedge tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she watched Zariah approach the house at the end of the street, the one with the wide glass windows and the freshly painted door. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite politeness, "are you looking for someone?" Zariah stopped, turned her head just enough to acknowledge her, her expression calm, unreadable. "No," she said quietly. "I live here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Heavy. Like the entire street had just inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The man from earlier let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he stepped closer, his shoes crunching lightly against the gravel lining the sidewalk. "Yeah, I don't think so," he said, his tone casual but sharp underneath, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "This property's been owned for years. Families here don't just change overnight." Zariah didn't respond immediately. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed, as if she had heard this exact sentence before in a dozen different forms, in a dozen different places, over the course of her life. And the truth was, she had. At 22, when she walked into her first investment firm meeting and was mistaken for an assistant. At 27, when a bank manager questioned the legitimacy of her company's funding. At 31, when a developer told her she didn't fit the profile of someone capable of closing a multi-million-dollar acquisition. The words changed. The meaning never did. Now, at 38, standing in the middle of a pristine suburban street where everything looked perfect on the surface, the pattern hadn't changed either. It had just found a new setting. A door opened somewhere behind her. Another neighbor stepped out, phone already in hand, pretending not to record but clearly capturing every second. Curtains shifted again. A garage door paused halfway open. The street wasn't quiet anymore. It was watching. Waiting. Measuring. Zariah adjusted her grip on the suitcase handle, her fingers tightening just slightly, not from nerves, but from recognition. This moment wasn't new. It was familiar. Predictable. And that made it controllable. "Ma'am," another voice called out, this one firmer, more official, cutting through the growing tension like it had authority behind it, "we're going to need to verify who you are before you go any further." Zariah turned slowly toward the source of the voice, her eyes landing on a woman in a tailored blazer walking down the sidewalk with purpose, heels striking the ground in sharp, even beats. Margaret Hill. HOA president. The kind of person who believed order came from control and that control belonged to people like her. Zoraya's expression didn't change. Not even a flicker. But something behind her eyes shifted, subtle and quiet, like a switch being flipped somewhere deep beneath the surface. Because this right here, this was the moment the test truly began. Margaret Hill stopped just a few feet away from Zoraya, her posture straight, her chin slightly lifted as if she had already decided how this conversation would end, and the faint click of her heels against the pavement seemed louder than it should have been, like each step carried authority that no one had questioned in years. Not here, not on this street where everything was controlled, curated, and carefully maintained to fit a very specific image. "I am going to ask you one more time," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm in a way that suggested it was not a request at all. "Who exactly are you, and what are you doing on this property?" Zoraya did not rush to answer. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle into everyone watching, just long enough for the neighbors to lean in a little closer, their curiosity mixing with something less comfortable, something sharper. She shifted her weight slightly, the handle of her suitcase still in her hand, and looked directly at Margaret, not up, not down, just straight, steady. "My name is Zoraya Brooks," she said, her tone even, controlled. "And I told you already. I live here." A small murmur moved through the crowd, quiet but noticeable, like wind brushing through leaves, and the man from earlier shook his head again, more forcefully this time, as if repetition alone could make his version of reality true. "That is not possible," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry. "We would know if a new homeowner moved in. This is not some rental block. People do not just show up." Zoraya glanced at him briefly, then back to Margaret, her focus never fully leaving the one person in the room who believed she held the power. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Zoraya's face, searching for something, a crack, a hesitation. Anything that would confirm the assumption she had already made. "We have procedures here," Margaret continued, her tone sharpening just a fraction. "This neighborhood operates under a homeowners association. Every resident is verified, documented, and approved. If you are claiming residency, then you will need to provide identification and proof of ownership immediately." Zoraya did not reach for her bag. She did not move toward the door. Instead, she let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, and for a moment her gaze drifted past Margaret, past the line of houses, past the carefully trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes, as if she could see something none of them could. 20 years ago, a different street, a different set of eyes, the same question wrapped in different words. "Who do you think you are?" The memory passed as quickly as it came, and when her focus returned, it was sharper, clearer, anchored. "You are asking me to prove that I belong," Zoraya said quietly. It was not a question. Margaret did not hesitate. "That is exactly what I am asking." A pause. Then Zoraya nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging the rules of a game she had already mastered. "Interesting," she said, almost to herself. The woman near the hedge crossed her arms tighter, her discomfort now more visible, while another neighbor stepped a little closer, phone raised higher, no longer pretending. A young boy stood near the edge of a driveway, watching everything with wide eyes, his earlier question still hanging in the air unanswered. Zoraya finally released the handle of her suitcase, letting it stand upright beside her, and slipped one hand into her pocket, not hurried, not defensive, just controlled. "Let me ask you something," she said, her voice still calm but carrying further now, reaching more than just Margaret. "When someone new walks into this neighborhood, what is the first thing you look at?" No one answered. Margaret's expression hardened. "This is not the time for questions," she said. "It is exactly the time," Zoraya replied, her tone unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakable. The street fell quiet again, not the calm quiet from before, but something heavier, something that pressed against the edges of the moment, because without raising her voice, without stepping forward, without doing anything that looked like resistance, Zoraya had shifted something, and even Margaret felt it, even if she refused to show it. "Identification," Margaret said again, more firmly this time, as if repeating it would restore control. Now. Zoraya held her gaze for a beat longer, then slowly reached into her pocket, her movements precise, measured, every second stretching just enough to keep every eye locked on her, and as her fingers closed around her phone, not an ID, not a key, but something else entirely, the tension on Maple Ridge Drive tightened, because whatever came next was not going to go the way anyone expected. The moment Zoraya's fingers wrapped around her phone instead of reaching for an identification card, a subtle shift rippled through the crowd, confusion tightening into suspicion as Margaret's eyes narrowed further, her patience thinning with every second that did not follow her expected script. "That is not what I asked for," Margaret said, her voice firmer now, sharper at the edges, the kind of tone that had likely ended most conversations in this neighborhood before they even began. Zoraya did not look down at her phone right away. She let it rest in her hand, her gaze still locked on Margaret, as if the device itself was secondary to the moment unfolding between them. "I heard what you asked," Zoraya replied calmly, her voice steady enough to cut through the tension without raising it. "I am just choosing how I respond." A few of the neighbors exchanged glances, their earlier confidence beginning to flicker, replaced by something less certain, something that did not quite fit the narrative they had already built in their heads. The man who had spoken first shifted his stance, his arms no longer folded quite as tightly, as if even he could feel the ground beneath the situation beginning to move. "This is not a negotiation," Margaret pressed, taking a small step forward, reclaiming space with intention. "You either provide proof, or you leave." Zoraya finally lowered her gaze to the phone, her thumb moving across the screen with deliberate precision, each motion unhurried, controlled, as if time itself bent slightly around her pace. "You keep using that word," she said softly. "Proof." The woman near the hedge let out a quiet scoff, though it lacked the confidence it had just moments ago. "Because that is how things work," she muttered, more to reinforce herself than anyone else. Zoraya glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable, then back to the screen. "Is it?" she asked, almost thoughtfully. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer fueled by judgment alone. There was curiosity in it. Uncertainty. The kind that makes people question whether they are still standing on solid ground. A notification lit Zoraya's screen, subtle but immediate, and her thumb tapped once, opening something that none of them could see but all of them felt. She raised the phone slightly, not high enough to display it to the crowd, just enough to position it between herself and Margaret, like a quiet line being drawn. "You asked for verification," Zoraya said, her tone unchanged, but the weight behind it undeniable. "So let us verify something." Margaret did not move, but her posture tightened, her control now something she was actively holding onto rather than something that came naturally. "I am listening," she replied, though her voice carried less certainty than before. Zoraya tilted the phone slightly, angling the screen just enough for Margaret to see the first line, then the next, then the one after that, each word landing heavier than the last. Margaret's eyes flicked across the display, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly, a crack forming where there had been none. "What is this?" she asked, though the question sounded less like authority and more like hesitation. Zoraya lowered the phone again, not revealing more than she intended, not rushing the moment. "That," she said calmly, "is the beginning of your answer." The man behind Margaret leaned slightly to the side, trying to catch a glimpse, but Zoraya adjusted her angle just enough to keep control of the information, of the pace, of the entire interaction. The young boy stepped closer to his mother, his voice quieter this time. "Is she in trouble?" he asked. His mother did not respond. She was watching too closely now. Everyone was. Zoraya's phone buzzed again, and this time she brought it to her ear, her movements smooth, practiced, like this was not an interruption but part of a sequence already set in motion. "It is me," she said simply, her voice low but clear enough for those closest to hear. A pause. Then, "Yes. I am on site." Margaret's composure tightened further, her eyes flicking between Zoraya and the phone, between what she believed and what she was beginning to question. "Who are you calling?" she demanded, the edge in her voice returning, but thinner now, stretched. Zariah did not answer immediately. She listened for a moment, then nodded once, a small, decisive movement. "Go ahead," she said into the phone. "Start the review." The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy, and for the first time since this began, the balance of control on Maple Ridge Drive was no longer clear, because Zariah was no longer responding to their demands. She was setting something in motion, something none of them understood yet, but all of them were about to feel. The words "start the review" did not echo loudly, but they carried farther than anything that had been said so far, because they did not sound like a reaction, they sounded like a decision already made somewhere beyond Maple Ridge Drive, somewhere none of them could see, and for the first time since Margaret stepped into the street with authority in her stride, she hesitated, not visibly to most, but just enough for the rhythm of the moment to break. "Review of what?" Margaret asked, her voice still firm but no longer absolute, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Zariah lowered the phone from her ear slowly, her gaze returning to Margaret with the same calm precision she had carried since the moment she arrived, but now there was something else behind it, something quieter, heavier, like the weight of knowledge she had not yet chosen to share. "Of everything," Zariah replied, her tone even, as if the answer required no further explanation. A faint breeze moved through the street, brushing against the trees, shifting a few loose leaves across the pavement, but no one moved, no one spoke, because the energy had changed again, and this time it was not subtle. The man who had first challenged her cleared his throat, trying to recover the confidence he had lost without realizing it. "This is getting ridiculous," he said, though his voice did not carry the same conviction as before. "You cannot just make calls and pretend you run something here." Zariah turned her head slightly toward him, just enough to acknowledge his presence, but not enough to give him control of the moment. "I am not pretending," she said quietly. The woman near the hedge shifted her stance, her arms slowly lowering, her posture less rigid now, as if the certainty she had been holding onto was beginning to slip through her fingers. "Margaret," she said under her breath, "maybe we should just check the records." Margaret did not respond immediately. Her eyes were still on Zariah, searching, calculating, trying to reconcile what she believed with what she was seeing unfold in front of her. "We have already established that there is no record of her," Margaret said finally, though the statement sounded more like a reminder to herself than a declaration to the group. Zariah's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened just slightly. "No," she said. "You established that you did not look." The words landed with precision, not loud, not aggressive, but exact, and they cut through the last layer of assumed authority that had been holding the scene together. A few of the neighbors exchanged glances again, this time not with judgment, but with doubt. The young boy looked up at his mother once more. "Why is she not scared?" he asked quietly. His mother swallowed, her eyes still fixed on Zariah. "I do not think she needs to be," she replied, almost to herself. Zariah's phone buzzed again, and this time when she glanced down at it, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a brief acknowledgement before she spoke. "I see it," she said into the phone, her voice calm, controlled. A beat passed. Then another. "Yes," she continued. "Send it through." Margaret's composure tightened again, but now it was different, not the confidence of control, but the tension of uncertainty. "Send what?" she demanded, the question sharper than before, edged with something closer to urgency. Zariah looked up slowly, meeting Margaret's eyes with a steadiness that did not waver. "The part you missed," she said. At that exact moment, a faint chime echoed from Margaret's own phone, subtle but unmistakable, and for a split second, no one moved, because the sound itself felt like a turning point, like a door opening somewhere they did not expect. Margaret's hand moved almost instinctively to her device, her fingers hesitating just above the screen before she finally picked it up, her eyes scanning whatever had just arrived, and as she read, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be seen by those paying attention. The line of her shoulders changed. The tightness in her jaw loosened. The certainty in her gaze fractured. "What is it?" the man asked, stepping closer now, his earlier confidence replaced by a need to understand. Margaret did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the screen again, slower this time, more carefully, as if each word required confirmation. Zariah watched her, silent, composed, giving the moment exactly as much time as it needed to unfold. "That cannot be right," Margaret said finally, though the words sounded more like disbelief than denial. Zariah tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but unmistakably clear. "You should read it again," she said. And as Margaret's eyes dropped back to the screen, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, because whatever she was seeing was not just information, it was a correction, a quiet, undeniable shift in reality, and Zariah had not raised her voice, had not taken a step forward, had not forced anything at all, she had simply let the truth arrive, right on time. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around her phone as her eyes moved across the screen again, slower this time, as if she was hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something more familiar, something that would restore the balance she had just lost, but they did not change, and the silence that followed stretched longer than anyone on Maple Ridge Drive was comfortable with. "Say something," the man pressed, his voice no longer confident but edged with unease, stepping closer as if proximity might give him access to whatever truth Margaret was now holding in her hands. Margaret swallowed, her gaze still locked on the screen, then finally lifted her eyes toward Zariah, and for the first time since she walked into the street, there was no authority in that look, only uncertainty. "This document," she said slowly, each word measured, "it shows a transfer of ownership." A murmur rippled through the crowd, louder this time, sharper, as if the entire street had just shifted beneath their feet. Zariah did not react. She simply stood there, composed, her posture unchanged, as if this moment had been expected all along. "A transfer," the man repeated, his brow furrowing. "From who?" Margaret hesitated again, her grip tightening on the phone before she finally answered. "From the previous holding group," she said. "To," her voice trailed for a fraction of a second, and that pause said more than anything else could have. "To Brooks Urban Development." The name landed differently. It did not echo loudly, but it carried weight, the kind that settled into the room and refused to move. The woman near the hedge blinked, her earlier certainty now completely gone. That is a major firm," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "They handle large-scale acquisitions." Zariah's gaze moved across the group briefly, not searching, not challenging, just observing, as if she was taking note of every reaction, every shift in posture, every change in tone. "You should keep reading," she said calmly. Margaret's eyes dropped back to the screen almost immediately, as if she could not help herself, and the longer she looked, the more the tension in her shoulders changed, no longer rigid with control, but tight with realization. "It says the acquisition closed 90 days ago," she continued, her voice softer now, less certain, "and that the development plan is under executive review." The man shook his head, confusion overtaking whatever confidence he had left. "That does not make sense," he said. "We would have been notified. The association would have been informed." Zariah tilted her head slightly, her expression still unreadable. "Would you?" she asked quietly. The question hung there, unanswered, because suddenly no one was sure what they were supposed to know anymore. A car door slammed somewhere down the street, distant but noticeable, yet no one turned to look. Every eye was still on Margaret, on the phone, on Zariah. "There is more," Margaret said, almost reluctantly, as if each new line she read made the situation harder to hold together. "It lists a primary executive authority assigned to oversee the transition." Another pause. Another shift. "Name," she read, her voice barely above a breath now, "Zariah Brooks." The silence that followed was absolute. No murmurs. No movement. Just stillness, like the entire street had been frozen in place by a truth they could not immediately process. The young boy's eyes widened, his gaze moving from Margaret to Zariah with something close to awe. "That is her," he said quietly, as if stating the obvious was the only thing that made sense anymore. The man who had spoken first took a step back without realizing it, his posture changing, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance no longer firm. "Wait," he said, his voice lower now, searching. "You are saying..." Zariah did not let him finish. She did not need to. She stepped forward, just one step, measured, controlled, enough to shift the space between them without breaking the calm she had maintained since the beginning. "You asked me to prove that I belong here," she said, her voice steady, carrying clearly across the now silent street. "The truth is," she continued, her gaze moving from one face to the next, not with anger, not with pride, but with clarity, "this place has already been transitioning." Margaret lowered the phone slowly, her hands no longer steady, her eyes fixed on Zariah in a way that no longer held authority, only realization. "Transitioning into what?" she asked, though the question sounded like she already knew the answer. Zariah held her gaze for a moment, then answered, her tone calm but final. "Something new." And in that moment, Maple Ridge Drive was no longer just a neighborhood watching a stranger arrive, it was a place standing on the edge of change, and for the first time, everyone there understood that Zariah Brooks was not the one who needed permission to stay. The word new did not sound dramatic when Zariah said it, but it settled over Maple Ridge Drive with a weight no one could ignore, because it was not just a description, it was a direction, and directions implied movement, change, consequences, and for the first time since this began, the people standing around her were no longer reacting to a stranger, they were trying to understand what their place was in something they had not chosen. The man who had first spoken let out a quiet breath, his earlier certainty completely gone now, replaced by something slower, heavier. "You are saying you bought the neighborhood," he said, his voice no longer challenging, but searching, like he needed the words to be clarified before he could accept them. Zariah did not rush to answer. She let the question sit in the air for a moment, long enough for everyone to hear it fully, long enough for it to land exactly where it needed to. "Not the way you think," she replied calmly. Margaret's grip tightened slightly on her phone again, though now it looked less like control and more like something to hold on to. "Then explain it," she said, her tone no longer commanding, but strained, like she was trying to keep up with something moving faster than she expected. Zariah shifted her weight slightly, her gaze moving across the street, taking in the houses, the identical lawns, the quiet order that had defined this place for so long. "This entire block," she began, her voice steady, "was part of a larger holding structure. Multiple properties grouped under a single investment entity. It made transitions easier. Quiet. Efficient." The woman near the hedge frowned slightly, trying to follow. "Transitions into what?" she asked. Zariah looked back at her. "Into something more valuable," she said simply. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, because value, in this context, did not sound like an upgrade for everyone. Margaret shook her head slightly. "We would have been informed," she said again, though now it sounded more like a question than a statement. "The association has protocols. There are notifications, votes, disclosures." Zariah's expression softened just a fraction, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "Those apply when ownership is fragmented," she said. "Not when it consolidates." The word landed harder than the last ones. Consolidates. It meant control. It meant decisions being made in fewer hands. It meant power shifting, not slowly, but all at once. The young boy stepped a little closer again, his voice quiet but clear. "So she owns it now," he said, looking up at his mother. This time, his mother did not hesitate. "It sounds like she does," she replied, her voice low, thoughtful, no longer defensive. The man took another step back, almost unconsciously, as if distance might help him process what he was hearing. "That is not possible without people knowing," he insisted, though the strength in his voice was gone. Zariah met his gaze briefly. "People knew," she said. The ones who were supposed to. Silence followed. A deeper kind this time. Not confusion. Not tension. Something closer to realization. Margaret lowered her phone slightly, her eyes still fixed on Zariah, but now there was something else in her expression, something that had not been there before. Recognition. Not of who Zariah was as a person, but of what she represented in this moment. "And what exactly does this transition mean for us?" Margaret asked, her voice quieter now, careful, like she was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Zariah did not answer immediately. She let her gaze move across each face again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if she was taking inventory, not of people, but of attitudes, of reactions, of everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Then she spoke. "It means," she said, her tone calm but firm, "that everything you assumed about control here needs to be re-examined." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to. The woman near the hedge looked down briefly, her arms now fully at her sides. The man said nothing at all. Even the air felt different, less certain, less fixed. Zariah reached for her suitcase again, her fingers wrapping around the handle with the same steady control as before, and she turned slightly toward the house behind her, the one that had sparked all of this, the one they had tried to keep her from. But she did not walk yet. Not fully. She paused just long enough to say one more thing, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet street. "You were not wrong to ask questions," she said. "You were wrong about which ones mattered." And with that, the balance that had once defined Maple Ridge Drive did not just shift, it began to unravel, quietly, completely, and far from finished. Zariah's words did not fade after she spoke them, they lingered, settling into the space between every person on that street, forcing each of them to sit with what had just been revealed, and for a moment, no one moved, no one interrupted, because the weight of realization had replaced the noise that once filled the air. Margaret was the first to react, but even that reaction was different now, slower, more measured, as if every step she took forward had to be reconsidered before it was made. "Re-examined," she repeated quietly, almost as if testing the word in her own mind, trying to understand what it meant for someone who had spent years believing she defined the structure of this place. Zariah did not turn back immediately. She stood still, one hand on the suitcase, the other relaxed at her side, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried something undeniable, something that had shifted from being questioned to being acknowledged, even if not everyone was ready to admit it out loud. The man who had challenged her earlier ran a hand across the back of his neck, his eyes drifting briefly toward the houses lining the street, as if seeing them for the first time not as fixed properties, but as pieces of something larger, something he had never considered. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter, less confrontational, more uncertain. Zariah turned her head slightly, just enough to face him again, her expression still composed. Still controlled. "Now," she said calmly, "we begin the process that was already planned." The woman near the hedge shifted her weight, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a careful curiosity. "Planned how?" she asked, her tone softer, almost cautious. Zariah looked at her for a moment, then back across the street, as if aligning her thoughts with something beyond the immediate scene. "Assessment first," she said. "Every property. Every structure. Every agreement tied to this block." Margaret straightened slightly at that, her instinct for control surfacing again, though it was no longer as solid as before. "You cannot just assess private homes without consent," she said, the statement coming out more as a defense than a command. Zariah met her gaze directly. "Ownership determines access," she replied, her tone even, not confrontational, just factual. The words landed with precision, and Margaret's lips parted slightly, but no immediate response followed, because for the first time, the rules she relied on did not apply the way she expected them to. A quiet voice spoke from the edge of the group, one that had not been heard before, an older man who had been standing near his mailbox, watching everything unfold without interruption. "If what she is saying is true," he said slowly, then this has already been decided somewhere else. No one argued with him. No one could. Because that was exactly what it felt like. Like the decision had already been made, and they were only just now catching up to it. Zoraya gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without expanding on it. There will be notifications, she continued, her voice steady, professional, as if outlining a process she had executed many times before. Formal documentation. Timelines. Options. The man frowned slightly. Options, he repeated. What kind of options? Zoraya paused for just a fraction of a second, and in that pause, the entire street leaned in without realizing it. That depends, she said, her eyes moving across the group again, measuring, observing, on how this community responds to change. The word change no longer sounded abstract. It sounded immediate. Real. The young boy looked up at his mother again, his voice barely above a whisper. Are we going to have to leave? He asked. His mother placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her eyes still on Zoraya, her expression thoughtful, no longer defensive. I do not know, she answered honestly. Zoraya heard the question. She did not ignore it. Her gaze softened just slightly as it passed over the boy, then returned to the group as a whole. No decisions are made without evaluation, she said, her tone calm, grounded. But evaluation requires honesty. Margaret exhaled slowly, the tension in her posture shifting into something else, something closer to acceptance, even if it was reluctant. And what exactly are you evaluating? She asked, her voice steady but quieter now. Zoraya held her gaze for a moment, then answered, her words clear, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand. Not just the properties, she said. The people. The silence that followed was immediate and complete, because in that moment, everyone understood that this was no longer about a misunderstanding on a quiet street, it was about something much bigger, something that had already begun long before Zoraya arrived, and something that was not going to stop just because they were not ready for it. The word people did not just settle into the silence, it reshaped it, turning what had been a confrontation into something far more personal, far more uncomfortable, because properties could be measured, contracts could be reviewed, but people carried history, behavior, choices, and for the first time since this began, the weight of the moment was no longer on Zoraya alone, it had shifted onto everyone else standing there. Margaret was the first to react, but her reaction was slower now, more deliberate, as if she understood that anything she said next would not just be heard, it would be remembered. You are evaluating residents, she said carefully, her tone no longer defensive, but cautious, like she was stepping into unfamiliar territory. Zoraya did not correct her immediately. She let the phrasing sit for a second before responding. I am evaluating patterns, she said, her voice calm, precise. The distinction mattered. It landed differently. The man frowned slightly, trying to process it. What does that even mean? He asked, his voice no longer sharp, but uncertain. Zoraya's gaze moved across the street again, not avoiding anyone, not confronting anyone, simply observing, as if she was already collecting the data she had mentioned. It means, she said slowly, how people respond when they think no one is watching. The woman near the hedge lowered her eyes at that, her earlier comments echoing back in her own mind, no longer justified, no longer comfortable. A faint sound came from one of the houses, a door closing softly, but no one turned to look. No one wanted to break focus now. Margaret exhaled, a quiet release of tension that had been building since the moment Zoraya arrived. This is a neighborhood, she said, her voice measured, almost careful. Not a case study. Zoraya looked at her directly. Every system is a case study, she replied. The only difference is whether someone is paying attention. That answer did not raise her voice, but it shifted something again, something deeper this time, because it reframed everything that had just happened, not as an isolated moment, but as part of something ongoing, something that extended beyond the street. The older man near the mailbox nodded slowly, almost to himself. "Then today was part of your evaluation," he said. Zoraya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It was," she confirmed. The man who had challenged her earlier looked away briefly, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in realization. "So we failed," he said quietly. Zoraya did not answer that directly. She did not confirm it. She did not deny it. Instead, she shifted her stance slightly, her posture still composed, still controlled. "That depends on what you do next," she said. The words hung there, not as a threat, but as a condition. The young boy looked up again, his voice soft but clear in the silence. "Can people change?" he asked. This time, several heads turned toward him, not in annoyance, but in attention, because the question cut through everything else, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Zoraya's gaze softened just slightly as it rested on him, and when she answered, her tone carried something different, something steadier, grounded. "That is the only reason evaluation exists," she said. The boy nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense in a way the rest of the conversation did not. Margaret looked down at her phone again, then back up at Zoraya, her expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, almost unsettled. "And if they do not," she asked, her voice quieter now, "what happens then?" Zoraya held her gaze for a moment, long enough for the weight of the question to settle fully, then answered with the same calm clarity she had maintained from the beginning. "Then the structure changes," she said. No one asked what that meant. They did not need to. Because now they understood that this was not just about ownership or documents or authority, it was about something deeper, something that could not be undone with a single explanation or corrected with a simple apology. Zoraya adjusted her grip on the suitcase again, her movement steady, controlled, and this time, when she turned toward the house behind her, she took a step forward, then another, the sound of her footsteps quiet but certain against the pavement. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Because the moment to challenge her had passed, and in its place was something else entirely, something heavier, something that would not be resolved in a single morning. And as she reached the walkway leading to the front door, one thing was clear to everyone watching: this was not the end of the situation, it was only the point where the real consequences were about to begin. Zoraya's footsteps slowed as she reached the edge of the walkway, not because she hesitated, but because the silence behind her had changed again, thicker now, heavier, filled with the kind of thoughts people do not say out loud but cannot ignore once they begin, and even without turning around, she could feel it, the shift in energy, the weight of realization settling deeper into every person still standing in the street. She stopped just short of the front door, her hand hovering near the handle, not touching it yet, not finishing the motion, because something in the moment still needed to unfold, something that had not yet reached its peak. Behind her, Margaret took a step forward, the sound of her heels quieter now, less certain, as if each movement required permission she no longer fully believed she had. "Zoraya," she said, her voice measured, but different, stripped of its earlier authority, carrying something closer to restraint. Zoraya did not turn immediately. She let the name settle in the air, acknowledged without reaction, then slowly looked back over her shoulder, her expression calm, controlled, unchanged. "Yes," she replied. Margaret hesitated for just a fraction of a second before continuing. "If what you are saying is accurate," she began, choosing her words carefully now, "then there should have been communication, formal notice, something that prepared this community for this." She gestured slightly, not at Zoraya, but at the entire situation, as if trying to define it without fully understanding it. Zoraya studied her for a moment, then turned her body slightly, no longer facing the door completely, but not fully returning to the street either, balanced between both directions, between leaving the conversation and continuing it. "Preparation assumes openness," Zoraya said quietly. "And openness is not something I saw when I arrived." The words were not sharp, but they landed with precision, and no one spoke to challenge them, because they could not honestly. The woman near the hedge looked down again, her shoulders lowering, the tension in her posture now replaced by something closer to discomfort. The man who had first spoken shifted his stance once more, his earlier confidence now completely absent, replaced by a quiet awareness that the moment had moved beyond anything he could control. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze steady but no longer rigid. "You are judging us based on one interaction," she said, though the statement sounded more like a reflection than a defense. Zoraya's eyes held hers, unwavering. "No," she replied. "I am confirming a pattern." That word again. Pattern. It echoed differently now, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion. The older man near the mailbox stepped forward slightly, his movements slow but intentional. "Patterns can change," he said, his voice calm, grounded. Zoraya nodded once, acknowledging the statement without hesitation. "They can," she agreed. The young boy looked between the adults, his small voice cutting through the tension once more. "Then why does it feel like something bad is going to happen?" he asked. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder again, but this time she did not immediately respond. She was listening too closely. Zoraya's gaze softened just slightly as it rested on the boy, then lifted back to the group. "Because change feels like loss before it feels like growth," she said. The sentence settled into the space around them, quiet but heavy, and for the first time, the fear in the air was not about her presence, it was about what came next. Margaret looked down briefly, then back up, her expression no longer defensive, but searching, as if trying to understand where her role fit into something that had already begun without her. "And what exactly is coming next?" she asked, her voice steady, but softer now. Zoraya held her gaze for a moment, then finally turned fully toward the door, her hand closing around the handle this time, her movement smooth, certain. "You will be notified," she said simply. The words were not dismissive, but they were final. She opened the door halfway, then paused again, just enough to add one more thing, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet street without needing to rise. "What matters is not what happens next," she said. "It is how you respond when it does." And with that, she stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft, controlled sound that echoed far louder than it should have, because it marked the end of one moment and the beginning of something none of them could fully see yet, but all of them now understood they would have to face. The door closed with a soft click, but the sound lingered longer than it should have, echoing through the stillness of Maple Ridge Drive like a final statement no one could interrupt, and for a few seconds, no one moved, because the absence of Zoraya's presence somehow felt heavier than when she had been standing there, like the center of gravity had shifted and left everyone else trying to find their balance again. Margaret remained where she stood, her eyes fixed on the door, her posture no longer rigid, no longer commanding, but suspended, as if she had not yet decided what to do next without someone to direct. The man who had spoken first glanced around, his gaze moving from face to face, searching for confirmation, for guidance, for anything that would restore the certainty he had lost. "So that is it," he said quietly, though it sounded less like a conclusion and more like a question no one could answer. The woman near the hedge let out a slow breath, her arms still lowered at her sides, her earlier tension replaced by something unsettled. "That cannot be it," she replied, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. "She just walks in and everything changes." The older man near the mailbox shifted his stance slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Everything was already changing," he said. "We just did not see it." That statement landed differently, not as a correction, but as a realization, and no one argued with him. Because now, standing in the quiet aftermath of what had just happened, it was clear that the moment they thought they were controlling had never really been theirs. Margaret finally lowered her phone completely, her fingers relaxing slightly as she exhaled, a quiet release of tension that had been building since the first words were spoken. "We need to review the association records," she said, her tone steady but no longer authoritative, more procedural now, like she was trying to rebuild structure from what remained. The man nodded quickly, almost too quickly. Yes, we should confirm everything, verify the documents, make sure this is legitimate." His words came faster now, as if speed might bring back control, but even he seemed to realize that the pace of the situation was no longer his to set. It is legitimate, the older man said calmly, not looking at anyone in particular, just stating what had already become obvious. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with thoughts, with calculations, with the quiet weight of consequences beginning to take shape. A car passed slowly at the end of the street, the driver glancing over briefly before continuing on, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, unaware that this street was no longer what it had been even an hour ago. The young boy looked up at his mother again, his voice small but clear. "Is she in charge now?" he asked. His mother hesitated, her gaze still on the house, her expression thoughtful. "I think she always was," she said softly. Margaret turned slightly at that, the words catching her attention, not because they were loud, but because they reframed everything in a way she had not considered. She looked back at the door, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if trying to understand the full scope of what had been set in motion. "If she is the primary authority," Margaret said slowly, almost thinking out loud, "then the association may no longer have the final say." The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The woman near the hedge shook her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That means everything we thought was permanent, is not." No one corrected her. No one reassured her. Because now, permanence felt like an illusion they had all been relying on without questioning. The man took another step back, his earlier presence diminished, his voice quieter than before. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked at the group, then back at the house, then down at her phone, as if weighing multiple paths at once. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured, careful, but no longer certain. "We wait," she said. The word did not carry authority. It carried necessity. Because for the first time, they were not the ones setting the pace. They were not the ones defining the outcome. They were responding. Reacting. Adapting. And as the streets slowly began to move again, as people shifted, as a few turned back toward their homes but did not fully leave, one thing was clear to all of them: whatever came next would not be decided in the open street, it would come from behind that closed door, from someone who had already seen more than they had, planned more than they knew, and was now in complete control of what happened next. Inside the house, the quiet felt different, controlled, intentional, like every detail had already been arranged long before Zariah stepped through the door, and as she set her suitcase down near the entryway, her phone vibrated again, not urgently, but precisely on time, as if the entire sequence outside had been nothing more than a checkpoint in a much larger process. She did not rush to answer it. She walked further in, her steps slow, measured, taking in the space that now belonged to her not just legally, but strategically, her gaze moving across the clean lines of the interior, the high ceilings, the wide windows that looked out onto the very street where everything had just unfolded. Then she answered. "Give me the update," she said, her voice calm, grounded. On the other end, a voice responded immediately, efficient, prepared. "Full file confirmed. Acquisition complete across all 12 properties on this block. Legal transfer finalized 90 days ago. HOA authority is now advisory only. They have no binding control over redevelopment decisions." Zariah nodded once, even though no one could see it. "And the resident profiles?" she asked. "Compiled and categorized," the voice replied. "Preliminary behavioral indicators logged. Today's interaction has already been added to the evaluation index." Zariah's gaze shifted toward the window, her eyes settling on the group still gathered outside, smaller now, quieter, but not dispersed. "And your assessment," she said. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, but calculation. "Resistance based on perception," the voice answered. "Not data. High probability of adjustment if guided correctly. However, initial bias indicators are above acceptable baseline." Zariah absorbed that without reaction, her expression unchanged, but her focus sharpening. "Prepare the next phase," she said. "Yes, ma'am," the voice responded. "Timeline," Zariah added. 48 hours for formal notice distribution. 72 hours for individual review sessions. Full restructuring proposal ready within 7 days. Zariah glanced down. Briefly, then back up at the street. "Move it to 5, she said. Another pause. "Understood. Adjusting timeline." She ended the call without another word, the silence returning instantly, but now it was filled with clarity, direction, control. Outside, Margaret had not left. None of them had. They were still standing there, not in confrontation anymore, but in anticipation, waiting for something they could not yet define. Zariah stepped closer to the window, not hiding, not revealing herself fully either, just enough to observe, to confirm what she already knew. The man who had spoken first shifted his stance again, his hands now at his sides, his posture no longer defensive, just uncertain. The woman near the hedge glanced toward the house, then quickly looked away, as if unsure whether meeting Zariah's gaze now meant something different than it had before. The older man remained still, his expression thoughtful, almost steady, like he had already accepted what others were still trying to process. Margaret finally turned slightly, her attention moving from the door to the rest of the street, as if recalibrating her role in a structure that no longer centered around her. "We need to organize," she said quietly, not commanding, but suggesting, her voice carrying just enough to reach the others. "If notices are coming, we should be prepared." The man nodded slowly, though it was clear he did not know what preparation meant anymore. "Prepared for what?" he asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked back at the house once more, her gaze lingering there, then spoke, her tone steady but reflective. "For change," she said. Inside, Zariah watched that moment without expression, without satisfaction, without reaction, because this was not about winning a confrontation, it was about executing a process, one that had already begun long before she arrived and would continue long after this moment faded. She turned away from the window, her focus shifting inward, toward what needed to be done next, because outside, they were still trying to understand what had happened, but inside, she was already moving forward. And as the quiet settled once more over Maple Ridge Drive, one thing had become unmistakably clear: the power they thought they had never disappeared, it was simply replaced, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission. Morning did not arrive the same way it usually did on Maple Ridge Drive, because even before the sun fully settled over the rooftops, something had already shifted beneath the surface, something quiet but undeniable, and it showed in the way people stepped outside their homes, slower than usual, more aware, as if the ground beneath them was no longer as certain as it had been just a day before. Zariah was already awake, standing near the window with a tablet in her hand, her posture relaxed but focused, her eyes scanning through rows of information that most people on that street did not even know existed, profiles, timelines, behavioral markers, all aligned into a structure that did not rely on assumptions, only patterns. Her phone chimed once, precise, expected. She did not hesitate. "Status," she said. The response came immediately, clear and structured. Notification packages delivered digitally and physically. All residents have received formal notice of ownership transition, evaluation process, and scheduled review sessions. First confirmations already coming in. Zariah nodded slightly, her gaze shifting toward the street as she watched the first signs of reaction unfold in real time. A front door opened across the way. Then another. A man stepped outside holding a printed document, his eyes scanning the page again as if hoping the words would change. They did not. The woman near the hedge stood just outside her door, the same paper in her hand, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something reflective. She looked up briefly toward Zariah's house, then back down at the document, as if trying to reconcile the two. Margaret emerged moments later, her posture composed, but no longer rigid, the document folded neatly in her hand, her expression focused, controlled, but different now, not resistant, not defensive, but engaged. She walked toward the center of the street, her movement steady, deliberate, and this time when she spoke, her voice did not carry authority, it carried responsibility. "Everyone has received the notice," she said, her tone clear but measured. Heads turned. People gathered again, but not in confrontation, not in judgment, in something else, something closer to alignment, even if it was uncertain. "There will be individual review sessions," Margaret continued, glancing briefly at the paper, then back up. "We need to take this seriously." The man who had challenged Zariah before looked at his own document again, his brow furrowed, but his voice no longer sharp. "This says our residency status is subject to evaluation based on compliance, contribution, and conduct," he read aloud, slower this time, more carefully. "What does that even mean?" The older man stepped forward slightly, his expression calm, grounded. "It means what we did yesterday matters," he said simply. No one disagreed. No one could. Because now it was written, formal, documented, no longer just a moment in the street, but part of a record that extended beyond their control. Inside, Zariah watched the scene unfold without interruption, her expression unchanged, her focus steady, because this was the part most people misunderstood. The reveal was never the end, it was only the beginning of accountability. Her phone vibrated again. "First session confirmed," the voice on the other end reported. "Margaret Hill. 10 minutes. Zariah glanced once more at the street, her eyes settling briefly on Margaret, who now stood not as an enforcer of rules, but as someone about to be evaluated by them. "Prepare the file," Zariah said calmly. "Already queued," the voice replied. Zariah turned away from the window, placing the tablet down with quiet precision, her movements smooth, controlled, as if every second had already been accounted for. Outside, Margaret took a breath, her grip tightening slightly on the paper before she looked toward the house, her gaze steady, no longer uncertain, but resolved. "I will go first," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the group. There was no resistance. No argument. Just a quiet understanding that the process had begun. And as Margaret stepped forward, walking toward the same door she had once stood in front of with authority, the dynamic had completely reversed, not with force, not with noise, but with structure, with truth, with something far more powerful than either of those things. Inside, Zariah moved toward the entrance, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as she reached for the door handle once again, but this time, she was not entering, she was receiving, and the difference between those two moments was everything. The door opened slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, and as Margaret stepped inside, the shift between outside and inside was immediate, unmistakable, like crossing an invisible line where assumptions no longer held any weight and only truth remained. Zariah stood just a few feet away, composed as always, her presence calm but undeniable, the same quiet authority that had unsettled the entire street now focused on a single interaction. Margaret paused for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this was no longer a conversation she controlled, this was a moment she had to meet on different terms. "Thank you for coming in," Zariah said, her voice even, professional, not cold, not warm, simply precise. Margaret nodded once, her posture straight but no longer rigid, her expression measured. "I understand this is part of the process," she replied. Zariah gestured lightly toward a chair across from a clean, minimal table, where a single tablet rested, already active, already displaying information Margaret had not yet seen but was about to face. "It is," Zariah confirmed. Margaret took a seat, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if she was aware that every action now carried weight beyond the moment. Zariah remained standing for a second longer, observing, not judging, then moved to the opposite side and sat down, aligning herself directly across from Margaret, the distance between them small, but the shift in power unmistakable. "This is not about punishment," Zariah began, her tone calm, steady. It is about alignment. Margaret listened closely, her hands resting on the table, no longer holding onto her phone, no longer needing it. Alignment with what? She asked. Zariah. Tapped the tablet once, the screen shifting to reveal structured data, timelines, notes, each piece connected, each moment recorded. With the standard required for this community to move forward, she said. Margaret's eyes moved across the screen, her focus sharpening, her earlier uncertainty now replaced by something more grounded, more deliberate. You documented everything, she said quietly. Zariah did not look away. Not everything, she replied. Only what mattered. The distinction was clear. Margaret exhaled slowly, absorbing that. And what happens now? She asked. Zariah leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but her gaze steady. Now you decide how you fit into what comes next, she said. Margaret held her gaze, not avoiding it, not challenging it, just meeting it. And if I do not? She asked, her voice calm but direct. Zariah did not hesitate. Then the structure adapts, she said. No threat. No emotion. Just fact. Margaret nodded slowly, understanding settling in, not all at once, but enough. Outside, the street remained quiet, the others waiting, watching, knowing that whatever happened inside would shape what came next for all of them. Inside, the silence between the two women was no longer tense. It was focused. Purposeful. Zariah reached forward slightly, her hand resting near the tablet but not touching it again. Yesterday, she said, her voice steady, you believed you were protecting a system. Margaret did not interrupt. Today, Zariah continued, you are being asked to understand it. Margaret's eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again, clearer now. And tomorrow, she said softly, we will have to live in it. Zariah gave a small nod. Exactly. The moment held, quiet, complete, not with a dramatic ending, but with something more lasting, something grounded in consequence and choice. Because the truth was never about proving who belonged. It was about revealing who understood what belonging actually meant. And as the first evaluation moved forward, one thing became undeniable, the power on Maple Ridge Drive had not just changed hands, it had changed meaning, and that was something no one there would ever be able to ignore again.